They had been marching for days beneath a gray European sky when the order was issued: surrender. For the German soldiers, who had endured the firestorm of battle, this command signified not only the conclusion of their struggle, but also the disintegration of everything they had been taught regarding honor, endurance, and loyalty to the Reich. Many were scarcely more than boys, grasping worn boots and ragged coats. Others were seasoned veterans who had witnessed too much of Stalingrad, Normandy, or the devastation of their own cities. As Allied trucks and trains filled with prisoners began their westward journey, whispers of rumors circulated among them, perhaps to England or to some camp in France. But then came the shock. They were not to be detained in Europe at all. Instead, they were being loaded onto enormous ships destined for the Atlantic. The journey itself was disorienting. Aboard the troop transports, the prisoners were crammed into holds meant for soldiers, not captives. The air was damp, laden with salt and oil. Yet for many, there was a peculiar sense of relief. The war was over for them. There would be no more shells, no more frantic defenses against advancing armies. Still, they murmured about what awaited them in America. Official propaganda had long depicted the United States as a realm of merciless capitalists, where workers lived in despair, and enemies were treated with brutality. Some feared torture or execution. Others anticipated hunger and grueling labor. The Atlantic crossing seemed to stretch indefinitely. Under the watch of American sailors, the Germans observed small details that contradicted their expectations. Meals were rationed, yet surprisingly generous compared to the starvation they had experienced in the final months of the war. Bread was soft, butter appeared on tin trays, and even coffee was served in thick mugs. The guards themselves were strict but not cruel, often treating the prisoners with a kind of casual indifference rather than outright hostility. These were not the monsters depicted in Nazi propaganda. They were young men, engaging in light-hearted banter among themselves, frequently offering cigarettes to one another without a second thought. Days merged into one another on the ocean, bringing with them a peculiar transformation in the German mindset. While fear persisted, it was now intertwined with an increasing sense of curiosity. What kind of country was this, where food appeared abundant even during wartime and where the guards exhibited such self-assurance? Some of the older prisoners recalled hearing about America's prosperity between the wars, tales of jazz, Hollywood, skyscrapers, and automobiles. However, those were merely distant images, a form of propaganda. What they confronted now was the stark reality, albeit still shrouded in uncertainty. Finally, the ships approached the American coastline. For many of these young men, it was their first encounter with a foreign shore so far removed from Europe. The skyline of ports like New York and Boston emerged from the fog, adorned with cranes, factories, and ceaseless activity. To prisoners hailing from bombed-out German towns where debris still smoldered, the sight was breathtaking. They had anticipated finding destruction or poverty here as well. Instead, they were met with vibrancy, industry, and strength. The war appeared to have left this land untouched in a different manner. The disembarkation process was swift, executed with military precision. German soldiers shuffled down the gangplanks under the watchful eyes of American MPs and were loaded onto trains heading towards the heartland. The landscapes flashing past the windows were unlike anything they had envisioned. Expansive fields, tidy towns, and billboards promoting products they had never encountered before. On the train, some prisoners conversed in hushed tones about how everything seemed so different from the grim portrayals of America they had been shown. The fear of brutality began to dissipate, supplanted by an unexpected feeling of unease regarding their own ignorance. It was during those initial days of capture and transport that the prisoners first started to realize that their captivity in America might not align with the severe punishment they had anticipated. However, they were unaware that among the most astonishing discoveries awaiting them were not implements of punishment or deprivation, but rather commonplace items from American life, such as cigarettes that appeared to be endless, and an intriguing sweet substance known as chewing gum. These minor indulgences would soon symbolize a foreign abundance forever etched in their memories. The initial impressions of America were imprinted in the prisoners' minds even before they arrived at their camps. The journey inland led them through lively stations where ordinary citizens carried on with their lives in a manner that felt unattainable to men who had endured relentless bombardment. From the windows of military trains, they observed children enjoying ice cream, shop windows overflowing with merchandise, and cars shining in the sunlight. For Germans, who had come from cities ravaged by airstrikes and ration cards that permitted only meager portions, it was as if they had landed on another world. The arrival at the camps was less dramatic than many had anticipated. Enclosed by barbed wire and monitored by watchtowers, the facilities appeared secure yet not inhumane. Rows of wooden barracks extended outward, their neatness almost resembling a quaint village. Inside, the bunks were simple but sturdier than expected. Each man received a mattress, a blanket, and his own personal space. In contrast to the disorder of the front lines, the conditions felt oddly civilized. The Americans upheld a strict discipline, yet it was a discipline devoid of animosity. Guards enforced regulations with authority, but not with sadistic pleasure. This perplexed the Germans who had anticipated degradation, or worse. Food emerged as the first significant revelation. In the dining halls, prisoners queued with trays and were served meals that seemed astonishingly plentiful. Potatoes, meat, fresh white bread, and vegetables that tasted as if they had just been harvested from a farm. Such provisions surpassed anything the men had experienced in years. Many had become accustomed to thin soups, ersatz coffee, and dry crusts at home. Even in captivity, they were receiving more than what their families might be consuming back in Germany. This contradiction was nearly unbearable. Some individuals could not help but feel a sense of guilt as they thought of their hungry mothers and siblings back home. The guards contributed to this dissonance. They were not the sadistic figures portrayed in Nazi propaganda. Rather, they carried themselves with an air of confidence, even nonchalance. Some were farmers' sons from Iowa, while others were factory workers from Ohio. Yet they all seemed to share a casual acceptance of abundance. They smoked freely, laughed amongst themselves, and displayed little interest in tormenting their captives. The divide between the victor and the vanquished was evident, yet it was not tainted by cruelty. To the prisoners, this behavior appeared almost incomprehensible. It was during these initial days that the Germans observed the rhythm of American life, even within the confines of the wire. Cigarettes were constantly present in the hands of guards and camp workers. The aroma of tobacco wafted through the air, sharp and sweet, lingering on uniforms. Packs changed hands with the same ease as one might exchange a coin. For German soldiers who had often endured weeks with only a few cigarettes, this sight was astonishing. It implied a world where such luxuries were not luxuries at all, but rather everyday items as commonplace as bread. Equally perplexing were the camp canteens and small stores, where prisoners could utilize their limited earnings from labor to buy goods. Even in these establishments, cigarettes were plentiful, arranged in neat rows, while something entirely foreign appeared on the shelves, brightly wrapped sticks of chewing gum. Few Germans had ever encountered such a phenomenon. Rumors circulated swiftly among the barracks. The Americans incessantly chewed on this sweet rubber, blowing bubbles and snapping their jaws with it. Some found it amusing, while others were dismissive, yet curiosity began to mount. What was this peculiar habit, and why did it appear so commonplace here? As time went on, fear gradually transformed into fascination. The prisoners had arrived in America anticipating punishment, only to discover themselves enveloped by signs of a society so materially affluent that even its prisoners enjoyed more comfort than many free citizens in Europe. Cigarettes and chewing gum, though small, emerged as symbols of this abundance. They would soon evolve into obsessions, tokens of a civilization that had managed to wage a global war without succumbing to hunger and devastation. It commenced almost casually. A guard leaning against the barracks wall tapped a cigarette from a pack and ignited it with a match struck on his boot. The nearby German prisoners could not help but gaze. The action itself was not unfamiliar. They had smoked whenever tobacco was available, but the sheer nonchalance with which the American handled the cigarette was disconcerting. He smoked leisurely, savoring it, then carelessly flicked the stub away before it was even extinguished. To men who had once preserved every fragment of tobacco, re-rolling half-burned butts and bartering crumpled papers for a single smoke, the gesture was nearly obscene. Soon the extent of the abundance became impossible to overlook. Cigarettes were ubiquitous. Cartons arrived by the truckload, filling camp storerooms and guardhouses. Red and white packs of Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields. They seemed to flow endlessly. Guards distributed them to prisoners not only as part of their rations, but sometimes casually, as if bestowing small favors. Initially, the Germans suspected it was a ruse, a method to soften them before some harsher treatment. However, the supply never wavered. Day after day, week after week, the cigarettes appeared, as constant as the bread and coffee. For numerous prisoners, smoking evolved into more than just a hobby. It became a ritual, a means to reclaim a fragment of identity amidst their confinement. Lighting a cigarette after enduring a long day of labor in the camp provided them with a brief sense of dignity. Conversations flowed more easily over the smoke. Bonds of friendship were forged in the thin haze that drifted above the barrack bunks. Even those who had never smoked prior to the war found themselves joining in, unable to resist the allure of something that had once been rare but was now abundant. The simple act of lighting a cigarette transformed into a collective experience, uniting men who had once marched under banners of conquest but were now reduced to mere numbers behind barbed wire. This abundance also turned cigarettes into a form of currency. Within days, an informal economy began to thrive within the camps. A man who could spare a few cigarettes might trade them for additional bread, assistance with laundry, or even protection from bullies. Packs of cigarettes became more valuable than coins, which held no significance in this context. The Americans appeared indifferent, perhaps even amused by the small marketplace that emerged. For the Germans, it represented both survival and a glimpse into the peculiar American tendency to commodify everything. What troubled them the most was not merely the presence of cigarettes, but the ease with which Americans were willing to part with them. Guards smoked incessantly, their fingers perpetually stained with nicotine, their laughter punctuated by clouds of bluish-gray smoke. They casually offered cigarettes to one another with a generosity that perplexed the prisoners. Where in Germany men hoarded the last remnants of tobacco as if they were treasures, here it was given away without a second thought. Cigarettes were not trophies of war. They were simply a part of life. This stark contrast compelled many to reevaluate the narratives they had been fed about America. Nazi propaganda had depicted the nation as decadent, corrupt, and riddled with poverty and racial conflict. Yet here, even prisoners of war existed within a haze of tobacco that seemed limitless. If the enemy could supply this for captives, what implications did that have regarding the strength and wealth of the nation itself? During the lengthy hours of camp life, as smoke ascended to the rafters, the question persisted. Eventually, the seemingly endless availability of cigarettes evolved into a symbol not just of indulgence, but of something more profound, an economy so extensive that it could afford luxuries even for its adversaries. For the German prisoners, who were still haunted by memories of scarcity and hunger from their homeland, it was both a source of comfort and a cause for unease. Cigarettes, which had once been a rare treat, transformed into a representation of the peculiar, almost unbelievable reality of captivity in America. While the prisoners were astonished by the sheer abundance of cigarettes, they were equally perplexed by the novelty of chewing gum. For many Germans, it was a completely foreign concept. They had been familiar with hard candy, licorice, and peppermints prior to the war, but had never encountered this peculiar substance that seemed to dissolve yet persist simultaneously. The first time a guard extracted a vibrant stick from a colorful wrapper and began to chew, the prisoners exchanged bewildered looks. Was it food, medicine, or some sort of American custom intended to mock them? Curiosity spread rapidly. A few courageous individuals accepted sticks of gum when offered, initially hesitant, perhaps anticipating an explosion of unfamiliar flavor or something unpleasant. Instead, they discovered sweetness, sharp mintiness, and occasionally fruity notes that lingered on the palate. Then came the confusion. The gum did not vanish. It softened, lost some flavor, yet remained in the mouth, pliable and chewable hour after hour. The Germans could scarcely comprehend it. To them, food was meant to be swallowed, nourishment consumed until nothing was left. Yet here was a luxury crafted not for survival, but for endless enjoyment. Whispers circulated through the barracks. Some claimed that chewing gum was composed of rubber. Others insisted it had medicinal properties. A few murmured that it was a ruse designed to keep their jaws occupied and their thoughts dulled. However, for the majority, it transformed into a source of fascination. The men observed the guards as they chewed for hours, rhythmically moving their jaws while walking, conversing, or standing watch. The sound of gum cracking and the sight of bubbles being blown and popped were simultaneously amusing and captivating. When the canteens began to sell gum, demand skyrocketed. Prisoners utilized their meager earnings from camp labor to purchase the brightly wrapped sticks, treating them almost as if they were contraband. A single piece could be exchanged for a favor or cherished in secrecy, chewed slowly to extend the enjoyment. Some even saved the wrappers as mementos, admiring the vibrant American designs, bold fonts, and cheerful slogans. In contrast to the drab utilitarian packaging of wartime Germany, they appeared as relics from another realm. For those experiencing gum for the first time, the encounter bore a peculiar psychological significance. It was not merely the novelty of the flavor. It was the underlying implication. Here was a society so affluent and self-assured that it could produce items serving no practical function other than enjoyment. At home, families were rationing bread and potatoes while children scavenged for scraps in bombed-out streets. Yet in America, individuals could squander resources on something intended solely for chewing and disposal. To the prisoners, this indulgence was both desirable and disconcerting, a persistent reminder of the devastation in their homeland. Chewing gum evolved in its own manner into a cultural bridge. Some prisoners eagerly embraced the habit, imitating the Americans, learning to blow bubbles and laughing when they burst on their faces. Others rejected it, viewing it as childish or degrading, a mark of defeat. Nevertheless, even those who derided it could not overlook the broader message. America possessed more than enough to pamper its soldiers, its guards, and even its adversaries. The gum, akin to cigarettes, became a form of quiet revelation. It was neither a weapon nor a piece of propaganda imposed upon them. Rather, it was a daily indulgence that conveyed significant insights about the society they observed from behind the wire. It was small, sweet, and seemingly insignificant. However, its effects endured, altering how many prisoners perceived the world beyond their devastated homeland. As the initial shock of cigarettes and gum transitioned into a routine, the rhythm of camp life began to establish itself. Mornings commenced early with guards summoning the men for roll call beneath the stark watchtowers. The prisoners formed neat lines, counting off with fatigued voices before dispersing to their designated tasks. Some toiled in fields outside the wire, harvesting crops or caring for livestock for nearby American farms. Others worked in workshops, mending equipment or crafting wooden furniture. A few were even dispatched to assist with construction, their labor rewarded with modest wages credited to camp accounts. It was through these wages that cigarettes and gum evolved into not just symbols of abundance, but essential components of daily survival. The canteens stocked them in what seemed like infinite supply, alongside soap, candy, and minor necessities. Each man quickly realized that to make life in the camp bearable, one had to participate in this economy. A pack of Lucky Strikes could be exchanged for an additional blanket, a stick of gum for a polished pair of boots, or a carton for a week of someone else's chores. The Americans permitted these transactions to thrive, perhaps recognizing that it maintained order by providing men with something to strive for, no matter how trivial it seemed. Within the barracks, the culture of trade evolved into a microcosm of society. Cigarettes became the preferred currency, as stable and dependable as any mark or dollar. Men who hoarded their smokes gained influence, while those who squandered them soon found themselves reliant. Gum, though less practical, possessed its own allure. A piece offered at the right moment could cultivate a friendship, alleviate tensions, or foster loyalty. In the stifling environment of confinement, even the smallest gestures held significant meaning. The Americans, observing from a distance, appeared to find amusement in this internal economy. Occasionally, guards would throw a few packs of cigarettes into a crowd, merely to witness the ensuing scramble, blending entertainment with indulgence. However, for the prisoners, these items symbolized more than mere enjoyment. They served as tangible evidence of America's power. Even amidst a war with millions of soldiers stationed abroad, the nation was still capable of providing luxuries to both its own troops and its adversaries. This reality gnawed at German pride more profoundly than any insult or punishment could. Daily routines further emphasized this disparity. Mornings began with coffee poured into steaming tin mugs, its fragrance permeating the corridors. Lunch frequently featured meat, vegetables, and bread, so white it appeared extravagant compared to the coarse rye loaves they were accustomed to. Work assignments concluded with breaks where men would sit smoking, chewing, and reminiscing about home. Evenings brought letters, meticulously censored, yet still serving as a vital connection to families far away. In the interim, cigarettes and gum offered not only comfort, but also a sense of continuity, providing structure to the long hours of waiting. Gradually, the prisoners started to adjust. They adorned their barracks with drawings, cultivated small gardens, and engaged in games with improvised equipment. Cigarettes often became stakes in poker games or bets on soccer matches played in the yard. Gum wrappers were meticulously folded into tiny sculptures, tokens exchanged among friends or kept as keepsakes. For men deprived of freedom, these minor rituals imbued their lives with meaning. The abundance of such seemingly trivial luxuries led many to ponder what awaited them upon their return home. They envisioned families in devastated German cities, scrounging for breadcrumbs while they, as captives, relished what felt like wealth. This dissonance weighed heavily, igniting discussions in hushed tones. Was this captivity a form of humiliation, or was it an unusual form of mercy? Regardless of the circumstances, cigarettes and gum persisted as constant silent reminders of their existence within a world that had not succumbed to the ravages of war. As weeks transitioned into months, the German prisoners began to grasp the profound cultural chasm that separated their homeland from the America enveloping them. This divide extended beyond mere barbed wire and uniforms. It encompassed the stark differences in lifestyles, values, and the things people appeared to take for granted. The presence of cigarettes and gum had already suggested this disparity, yet as the men continued to observe, their discomfort deepened. They exchanged stories from their homeland, shared in hushed tones during the night on their bunks. One individual recounted the harsh winters of the final years of the war, when his family sought refuge in a cellar, meticulously dividing a crust of bread into minuscule portions barely visible to the eye. Another reminisced about mothers boiling weeds to create soup, while children scavenged through debris in search of anything edible. In Germany, tobacco had transformed into a rare luxury, accessible only to officers or through the black market. Even the most seasoned soldiers often resorted to smoking remnants of dried leaves, stuffed into paper, choking on the bitter taste. Yet here, in captivity, guards discarded half-smoked cigarettes as if they held no value. The prisoners could not escape the degradation of this comparison. They had fought under banners that proclaimed German superiority, repeatedly told that theirs was the most advanced and disciplined nation on the planet. Yet now they found themselves confined behind wire, observing a society that appeared wealthier, freer, and more self-assured than anything they had previously experienced. The chewing gum symbolized this reality. It was neither essential nor practical. Nevertheless, millions of Americans consumed it without a second thought. For the Germans, it represented an almost derisive exhibition of affluence. Conversations frequently returned to the topic of propaganda. Many recalled posters and speeches asserting that America was a decaying society, rife with corruption, beset by unemployment and despair. However, how could this be reconciled with the overflowing camp supplies, the fresh provisions, and the continuous influx of cigarettes? Some contended that it was merely a facade, that the prisoners were only being shown a superficial view. Others maintained that the truth was irrefutable. The Reich had deceived, and America was far more powerful than anyone had anticipated. For younger soldiers, the cultural shock took on a more intimate aspect. They observed American guards in pristine uniforms, with cheerful smiles and pockets jingling with coins that they spent on candy and soda from camp vending machines. They witnessed them writing letters home, assured that their families resided in homes unscathed by bombs, surrounded by operational shops and schools. These minor observations resonated more profoundly than lectures. They provided glimpses of a reality that starkly contrasted with the devastated streets of Dresden or Hamburg. Even the simple act of chewing gum became a symbol of disparity. Americans chewed while on duty, while conversing, and while relaxing in the sun. The rhythmic popping of gum became the soundtrack of their captivity. Although some Germans ridiculed it as childish, others envied the casual freedom it represented. The ability to chew without concern, to squander time and resources on something deemed unnecessary. That was power. It illustrated a nation so confident in its wealth that it could indulge in habits that appeared trivial to those raised in scarcity. The more they observed, the more the prisoners understood that captivity in America was not merely about awaiting the end of the war. It was a confrontation with an uncomfortable reality. The world they had been taught to loathe had surpassed them, not only in military might, but in the very essence of daily existence. Cigarettes and gum were not merely luxuries. They were evidence of abundance, symbols of a culture that had flourished even as theirs crumbled into ruin. When mail finally reached the camps, the prisoners encountered another painful contrast. Letters from home arrived infrequently, often delayed and always censored. Each envelope bore the faint scent of war-torn Europe, ink-smudged, paper-fragile, handwriting filled with anxiety. Families wrote with caution, conscious that every word would be scrutinized by Allied censors. They referred to their health in ambiguous terms, discussing survival amidst adversity. However, the Germans could discern the underlying reality between the lines: hunger, fear, and the gradual decline of hope. Meanwhile, the prisoners sat at rudimentary desks under the watchful eyes of guards, composing their own letters back across the Atlantic. They meticulously detailed their daily lives, mindful of censorship, yet it was impossible to conceal everything. Some acknowledged that they were receiving ample food, far better than they had anticipated. Others alluded to the peculiar abundance around them, often veiling it in careful language to avoid sounding boastful. We are treated with respect, one might write. There is sufficient food, even minor comforts. Yet the true secret resided in what remained unspoken, the endless supply of cigarettes and gum that had become the camp's currency and emblem. Nevertheless, those luxuries found their way into letters indirectly. A prisoner might note that his health was improving, his nerves more settled, his spirits higher. His family, struggling back home, would remain unaware that much of this improvement stemmed from the haze of tobacco smoke and the casual chewing of gum. Some wrote more openly, mentioning the availability of cigarettes even to prisoners, as if to reassure their families that captivity was bearable. The irony was poignant. Men behind barbed wire were smoking freely, while their fathers and brothers in Germany resorted to lighting scraps of newspaper rolled into tubes. There was also envy, though seldom admitted openly. The men understood that detailing too much abundance could hurt their loved ones, enduring ration cards and bombings. Yet among themselves, they acknowledged the truth. Life in captivity was in some respects easier than life at home. One man confided in another that he felt guilty chewing gum while picturing his wife dividing a single potato among their children. Another confessed that he had smoked more in a week of captivity than he had in the entire previous year of combat. These confessions spread quietly, resembling smoke curling up to the rafters. The Americans naturally censored any content that suggested military affairs, yet they permitted accounts of everyday life to be shared. Perhaps this was intentional, a means of informing German civilians that their men were being treated well, thereby sowing seeds of doubt regarding Nazi propaganda. Indeed, families who received such letters could not help but ponder, if their sons wrote about coffee, cigarettes, and gum, what did that imply about the enemy's strength? What did it reveal about the world beyond the borders of the Reich? The outcome was a peculiar duality. The prisoners endured the persistent pain of separation, the constant fear for their families, while simultaneously grappling with the uncomfortable awareness that, in some respects, they were better off. Cigarettes and gum, those seemingly insignificant luxuries, transformed into symbols of that divide. They served as reminders that America's abundance extended even into the camps, while Germany faced starvation. Moreover, within every letter, every censored phrase, lingered an unspoken reality. Captivity here was not merely about survival. It was an awakening to a world that their homeland could no longer compete with. When the war concluded and repatriation commenced, the prisoners carried their possessions in small bundles: clothes, letters, perhaps a book or two. However, what weighed most heavily upon them were their memories. They boarded ships once again, this time journeying back across the Atlantic filled with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Some yearned to reunite with their families, while others dreaded the ruins that awaited them. Yet nearly all of them harbored one peculiar, lingering thought: the image of cigarettes and chewing gum, ever-present symbols of their captivity. Back in Germany, the contrast was stark. Cities lay in ruins, food lines snaked through the streets, and homes were cobbled together from bombed remnants. Families welcomed their returning sons with tears, but beneath the joy lay a profound despair. The prisoners swiftly came to understand that sharing their narratives of American abundance was not a simple task. To openly discuss cartons of cigarettes and brightly wrapped gum would seem like a fantasy, or even worse, an act of betrayal. Yet in the company of close friends, stories emerged from guards who smoked incessantly, of stores brimming with goods, and of prisoners who had never experienced hunger. The listeners, gazing at their empty cupboards, could hardly believe it. For many of the former captives, this experience transformed their perception of the world. They had arrived in America anticipating cruelty, only to discover a society overflowing with luxuries, even amidst wartime. Cigarettes and gum transcended mere memories of indulgence. They became valuable lessons. These small items illustrated the resilience of an economy that remained unscathed by devastation. They showcased the strength of a culture bold enough to extend comforts to its adversaries. For men who had once held beliefs in German superiority, this was a sobering realization. Some carried these lessons into their new lives. Years later, as prosperity gradually returned to West Germany, former prisoners of war would reminisce about the taste of American gum and the sight of guards casually tossing cigarettes. They recounted to their children how peculiar it felt to endlessly chew on something that never seemed to diminish, how exhilarating it was to smoke without the constraints of rationing. For them, these experiences became a shorthand for the broader truth that America had triumphed, not solely through bombs and tanks, but through its abundance. Others reflected on the psychological burden of those luxuries. Being surrounded by wealth while knowing that one's homeland was suffering from starvation was both a source of comfort and humiliation. It fostered resentment in some, admiration in others, but it left an indelible mark on all. Cigarettes and gum emerged as symbols of captivity, yet also as pivotal moments in their lives, confronting them with realities that propaganda had obscured. This theme recurred repeatedly in post-war memoirs and oral histories. German soldiers recalled not only the battles they lost or the comrades they buried, but also the unusual shock of receiving too much during their captivity. They remembered writing letters home, deliberately leaving out details of their abundance. They recalled the guilty pleasure of blowing bubbles with gum and the absurdity of trading cigarettes as if they were currency. These memories persisted long after their uniforms were stored away and new lives commenced. Ultimately, the narrative of German prisoners in America encompassed more than just defeat and survival. It was also about discovery. The endless supply of cigarettes and the peculiar sweetness of gum represented more than mere indulgence. They unveiled a world functioning on an entirely different level of prosperity. Although the prisoners returned to their homeland, they carried with them the undeniable awareness that they had caught a glimpse of a future that their country would take decades to reconstruct. Cigarettes and gum, seemingly insignificant and ordinary, had transformed into the unexpected symbols of a shattered generation's confrontation with reality.